Hey everybody. In today's tutorial video, we're going to be taking a look at how you can extract underlying data from a view in Tableau. We're going to be doing this programmatically, so maybe you want to write a script that's going to reach out to a Tableau server view, maybe one like this, and it's going to fetch the underlying data so that you could get the data that's fueling this visual, maybe export it to a CSV or something. So that's exactly what we're going to be doing in this video. And just to set the stage a little bit more, this is the workbook that we're using and that we're going to publish content to Tableau Server from. And specifically, we're going to take a look at this visual a bunch where sure, you have the sales numbers, but you also have some numbers kind of coloring the chart behind the scenes. So we have this colored by profit ratio. And so if you were to hover over any of these bars, you see a sales number, you see a profit ratio, and you see the subcategory this belongs to. Something we're also going to touch on is what if you have filters? Can we specify a value when we're querying data from this view? And we'll see that indeed you can. We could even filter through all of these and pull a version of the underlying data for each of these filter values. So let's dive in. So for starters over here, we're going to be using the query view data endpoint. We'll actually be using a library here, tableau-api-lib, which implements all of these endpoints for us. But it is good to know that behind the scenes here, if you want to know more about what's happening, you could always reach out to the Tableau Server REST API documentation. And you can see things, for example, how do we need to specify filters if we are trying to apply a filter that exists in that view when we are pulling data from it. So let's hop into the code, and we're going to be using a Jupyter notebook as usual, and we're using tableau-api-lib, so I'm importing that, and I'm importing this Tableau server connection in particular so that we can establish that link between our Jupyter notebook here and the Tableau server. And I'm also going to import some useful functions that exist inside that library. We'll see how this can make our lives a good bit easier in this process. And then we are also going to be making a little bit of use of the pandas library here. That's what we're going to use when we pull the view data into Python. We'll store it inside of a pandas data frame, so it's easy to manipulate and work with. And then this is just for some quality of life type thing for some type hints that I'm using in the code. All right, so as for configuration, there is a video linked in the description of this one, which will explain all of this for you if you're new to this library that I'm using, tableau-api-lib. Basically, we're just defining the details of our connection. Then we come down here and we're going to establish that connection to the environment that we specified above, and we're going to sign in. So now at this point, let's just take a quick look at the views that we actually have on the server. So if you were adapting this whole process to your own environment, you would probably want to do this. Take a quick look at all the views that exist. Right here, I'm just looking at the first two that come through. And we can see that we get a bunch of information about all of our views, including the ID. So this is really the important piece of information here. However, just as a convenience factor, let's go ahead and say maybe you don't know exactly which view that you're querying yet and you need to find it. So something that I often do is I'll come in and I'll say, maybe I know the workbook that the view belongs to. And that's going to be an easy way to narrow down the view that I'm looking for. And so you'll notice over here this column named workbook that's returned to us. This has a lot of embedded information in it, such as tags, the ID of the workbook. There's also some other information like the name of the workbook. So what we're going to do down here is we're going to make use of this tableau-api-lib's flatten dict column function, and we're going to unpack the keys name and ID for our workbook. So that's why we specify here the column name is workbook. That's the column that we're extracting these keys from, and these are the keys that we're extracting. So if we run this, we'll see now that our workbook column disappears because it has been magically turned into this flattened information. Flattened just meaning that instead of it existing inside this nested dictionary or nested JSON object, it's now been kind of unpacked for us so we can make use of it. Now that we can see all the workbook names, you could more easily say, oh, the workbook I care about is query view as crosstab v2. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. And now we have a much more manageable list of views. These are all the views that belong to that workbook. These are the ones that we were just poking around with in Tableau Desktop. So let's go ahead and store Visual A's view ID and Visual B its view ID. And we do that down here. So let's take a look at how we can query data from Visual A. So just to jog your memory on that, this is the view. As it exists out on Tableau Server, it looks like this. And so let's query this thing's data. We define the view ID, then we go ahead and make use of this querying function that's called getViewDataFrame. That's stumbled on that one a bit. GetViewDataFrame. And what this function's actually doing behind the scenes is it's going out and it's using this endpoint, and it's doing a bunch of kind of things in the background that would be a bit tedious if we wanted to build this from scratch. So it's just a nice function that exists for us that says, oh, you want to pull data from a view. Let's go ahead and knock out these few steps that otherwise you would have to write code from scratch to do. So all we have to do is supply this function with our connection object, and then we also supply the view ID that it's pulling data from. And if we run this, we're going to end up getting a pandas data frame that has all of that data that's at play inside of that view. So for many of you, this might be just exactly where you want to stop. Maybe you just really simply want to grab data from a view. But let's also show a situation where you're pulling data from a view and you want to do a little bit of cleanup. So this other view, Visual B, we have a table that looks like this, but we also have some information over here in the marks card. And it's worth noting that any of this information, like I have some kind of random parameter down here that's playing some role in the marks card. I have this constant that's giving me a size for all of these squares out here. So all this stuff that might be just something that's not really an element of the visual itself, maybe that's information that after I query the view, I want to push that out of my data frame. Like I don't actually care about these parameter values. So in that case, I could query this view, and I just went ahead and defined its view ID, which was available from all of that data up above in the Jupyter notebook when we were querying our views. And I run the getViewDataFrame function for that view. And we're looking at this data output, and we basically say, all right, I like this column. Maybe I like this column, but I want to rename it. I like this column. I don't need this column. I don't need this column. And I do want this one. So what we could do is, because this is a pandas data frame, we could just define a list of certain columns that we don't want. That's what I've done here with this irrelevant columns list. And then we can make a list that's basically just every column that is not in this list. So all the columns we actually care about. So we end up with something like this: subcategory, year of order date, profit ratio, and sales. And then I'm going to rename one of those columns. This year of order date is going to turn into just year. And I'm just going to supply the names in the order that's appropriate here. So like for example, we ran this relevant columns and we could see subcategory, then year, and then profit ratio, and then sales. So I want to make sure I keep that order here as I provide the new names that I want. And then I'll just simply say, give me a data frame that has only the relevant columns, and then change all of the columns to be those renamed columns I just defined. So then at the end there, we can just run this data frame and we can see I no longer have those irrelevant columns, and I've also renamed one of these columns that I wanted to keep. All right, so that's how you can take that querying view data, process it a little bit, get that data in the format that you want. But what if you want to filter on your view? So let's take a look at this again, and we can see that there are these filter options here under segment, and for view A, for visual A, this is the one that we're actually going to do this for. We could see that these numbers come out a little bit different depending on the filter value that we have in place. So in this case, we're using segment. Like the example we're about to go through is basically the same thing as if we were to drag segment out into our visual and make it like a subcategory as it belongs to each segment. This is basically the table that we're going to be building. But never mind that we could build that visual from scratch. What I want to demonstrate here is what if you have a filter value, and in this case we have segment. What if you have a filter in place and you want to get this visual, but only for the data relevant to one of those specific filter values? Then you could build something that looks like this. For starters, let's say that one of my filter values out here is home office, and that has a space in the value. Something that we're going to need to consider is that since we're doing this programmatically, since we're querying the view and sending a request to the server, the URL parameter is going to follow this pattern here. So like we have whatever endpoint we're using, this GET request has us asking for that data. And then at the end of that endpoint, you can see down here, we're going to be adding some kind of filter parameter. Now, the thing is you can't have spaces and certain characters that aren't URL friendly when you're making the request, or it's going to break things. So all we're doing here is we're converting any blank space into a %20. Now you could Google this, you could Google special characters and what their codes should be if you need to replace any of this text. So I just wanted to insert one of these kind of messy situations so that you could see, oh, it's not that hard to overcome this, but you do need to consider this because these queries are both case sensitive and also the URL endpoint itself is sensitive to not considering these special characters. So I'm going to define a couple things here. I'm going to first of all define these helper functions. The first one is just replacing blank spaces with that %20. And then the second one is saying, all right, let me pass in a dictionary, which would simply just be a key value pair. And the key is just some arbitrary name of the filter parameter I want to apply. And then the value is the actual string of text, much like this, that we would want to apply to our request. So let's run this and then define some variables down here. In this case, the field name, this is the actual name of the field that we're filtering on. In this case, that is segment. And again, this is case sensitive, so you don't want to come in here with a lowercase s. That filter would not be successful. So keep in mind, we do need to make this exactly as it is spelled and as it exists in the Tableau workbook. And then I'm just going to add in some values for that filter. In this case, I'm just hard coding it. If you wanted to get really fancy, you could make a different sheet and then query all of the values that exist within that field. But that's a little bit more advanced than I want to get for this tutorial. Okay, so now we're going to take a look over here at the parameter dict that we're going to build that's going to help us filter this visual. So again, we have just some arbitrary key name here. And then we have the actual value that's going to get appended to our URL. So in this case, it's going to read something like VF segment equals, and then home office. So let's see what that ends up looking like. We get this. So just to look back here at this documentation one more time, we can see that that pattern that they're telling us that we need is very much getting stitched together for us here. And let's see what happens. When I run that query to get the view data frame, now I'm passing in this extra argument here called a parameter dict. And a parameter dict is quite simply just different URL parameters that get appended to the request so that we can specify some certain things like maybe sorting or filtering, or even if you were doing a GET request to like get users on your site, you could pass a parameter that tells you how many items get returned and such. So in this case, the parameter dict is defining the filter that we want to apply, and we can see that that filter does get applied. So you can see for accessories, we get a sales number of 32,000. So if we go out to that workbook and we change our segment here to home office and we look at accessories, we should get that same number, 32,000. All right, so that's how you can apply a filter. But now let's take that even a step further. So we filtered on home office, but there was really no indication that we had done so. So we just have to kind of remember that we filtered on home office. So this is just a little trick. Since we're using Pandas data frames, we could easily add a column here that tells us that we have a segment filter and then what we filtered on. So we can just do that with this line of code. It's really simple. And let's run this. And now we have that extra benefit of knowing what we filtered on. And similarly, if we want to get really fancy, let's say that we needed to build a data frame or a CSV file that went through and it filtered that view for every one of the possible filter values, and then just appends that together. Maybe we're building a report that we share with people, and they need that underlying data that's behind the Tableau visual so that they can do some other processing with it. So we could do that. And I don't want to get into the weeds here. This is getting a bit advanced, but basically the process here is I'm going to define a parameter dict just like we did up here for home office. I'm going to define basically one of these for each one of those filters that I want. And then we're going to loop through and we're going to generate a query for each one of those filters. So each one of these guys is going to get their own query. And we're going to end up just sandwiching all of those outputs together. So if you want to try this out yourself, just pause the video here and you could type this out. But we're just going to blast through this so you can see what it looks like, so you can see what's possible. So right now I'm running this process and it already completed, and it went out and it queried each one of those different outcomes where we're filtering segment on home office and then corporate and then consumer. And if we take a look at this segment filter, we can see that this value changes. This is basically a completely different data frame down here that got appended to the first one. And then underneath corporate, we start to see consumer values. So in that final iteration of the loop, it was filtering down to consider consumer and then just added all of that data in. So at the end of the day there, we have this combined filtered view data frame that we could just now spit out into a CSV file. So we can just take a quick look at this, see what it looks like, and this is what we end up with. All right, so that's handy to know about. And then one final thing that I wanted to touch on here is right now we're just querying straight up views. What I mean by that is we're querying worksheets. However, there's also dashboards. So sometimes maybe you want to reach out and you want to query a dashboard. And just a little word of caution here. Whenever you do this, like let's say you just had one visual inside of a dashboard, which is pretty rare. This process would work out for you. But basically, if we query a dashboard and we want to get its view data, it's only going to find the first view in the dashboard and it's going to query that. So let's see this in practice. Out here we have one dashboard that's called dashboard single view, another one dashboard multi-view. And as we query this for the single view, let's see what the output looks like. So that's getting the right stuff. But now let's do the multi-view. And we're going to be seeing the exact same thing we got for the single view. So in that multi-view query, it basically found this view and then just queried that view's data, but it didn't get us this view's data. So what do you do with this? I would just recommend that if you need to query a view's data, even if that view exists inside a dashboard, maybe you want to publish separately that specific view's data just to an individual worksheet. Maybe you don't even show it. You could even put that in a different project if you don't want people to accidentally click into the view instead of the dashboard that you want them interacting with. But I think the easiest way to handle that is, instead of just getting the data for only the first view that exists in the dashboard, publish those other views separately and then query them specifically to get the data that you want from them. All right, so that really does it for this tutorial. We walked through how you can query view data from views that you published up to Tableau. And there is also a step-by-step version of this that exists out in Medium. So feel free to go read this article as well if you kind of like following a step-by-step instruction as you actually implement this. I'll post a link to this in the description of the video. So thanks for tuning in and see you next time.